I was 2 hours into fixing her pipes when she came downstairs, stood in the doorway, and asked me the one question I had not prepared an answer for. And I want to tell you what she asked. But first I need to tell you about the 9 months that made it the most complicated question anyone has put to me in my adult life. My name is Joel. My neighbor is Sylvie, and what happened between us started with a burst pipe in February and ended somewhere I still don't have a clean word for. Somewhere past friendship and short of something else, built out of borrowed tools and late coffee, and the specific intimacy that grows between two people who spend enough time in each other's houses to know where the fuses are. Sylvie moved in next door in the middle of a cold snap. I saw her from my driveway carrying boxes, alone, making 3 trips where most people would have asked for help with 2. She was methodical about it. Deliberate, she had the quality of someone who had learned to rely on her own logistics and had made a kind of peace with that. Not a defeated peace, but an efficient one. I offered to help with the last 2 boxes. She thanked me with the precision of someone who is grateful and also wants to be clear they were managing fine without you. I respected that immediately. We were cordial for the first 6 weeks. Wave from the driveway. Brief exchange at the mailbox. The ordinary grammar of 2 neighbors who are not yet anything more than adjacent. Then February hit, and a pipe in her basement froze and burst on a Tuesday night, and she knocked on my door at 10:15 with water already through her ceiling, and the expression of someone applying very deliberate control to a situation that deserved panic. I'm a contractor. Residential and light commercial, 15 years. I told her to go turn off the main. Told her where it usually was in houses built the same decade as hers, and went to get my kit. It took 2 hours. She brought me coffee at the 1-hour mark without asking if I wanted it, which told me she'd been watching the clock and paying attention to the kind of detail that most people miss when they're worried about their ceiling. We didn't talk much while I worked. She sat on the basement steps and occasionally handed me things I pointed at, and the silence between us had the quality of 2 people who are comfortable enough not to fill it, which is a thing you usually have to earn, and which we had apparently arrived at without trying. When I was done, she said she wanted to pay me. I said no. She said she was going to anyway. I said I'd be insulted. She looked at me for a moment with the expression of someone revising their understanding of a situation, and then she said, "Fine, I'll feed you instead." She made eggs. It was 11:30 at night. They were very good eggs. That was February. By March we had a rhythm that had assembled itself without either of us designing it. She knocked when something needed looking at. I knocked when I had extra of something. Food, mostly, because I cook in quantities calibrated for a household that is no longer the size it used to be, a detail I did not explain and she did not ask about. We drank coffee on her porch on weekend mornings when the weather allowed. We watched a documentary series she recommended in separate rooms and texted commentary at each other in real time, which is a specific kind of closeness that arrives sideways when you're not looking for it. I was not looking for it. I want to be honest about that. My marriage had ended 14 months before Sylvie moved in, and the ending had been the kind that doesn't leave you bitter so much as careful. Careful about where you put weight, careful about which floors you trusted, careful in the way of someone who has learned that structures they believed were sound can fail without warning if the foundation was wrong from the start. I was not closed. I was not damaged in a way I'd given up on fixing. I was simply careful, and I had decided that careful was a reasonable way to be for a while. Sylvie, I understood gradually, was careful in a similar way for reasons she did not detail and I did not pursue. She lived alone and seemed to prefer it, or at least had accommodated it deeply. She had friends she saw regularly, a sister she called on Sunday evenings, a life that was full on its own terms. She was not waiting for anything. She was not the kind of person who arranges herself around an absence. Which is exactly why the rhythm between us was what it was. Two careful people who had found a frequency that suited them and had not examined it too closely because examining it too closely might have changed it. By June, I was at her house twice a week, sometimes more. I fixed the pipe. Then the basement drain. Then the gutter that pulled away from the fascia in a rain. Then the kitchen faucet that had been dripping since before she moved in. She stopped offering to pay after the third job. She fed me instead, always, and the meals were never casual. She cooked the way she did everything, with preparation and attention, and the table she set for two felt, by July, like a thing that had always been there. I noticed things. I noticed that I timed certain jobs to finish at the hour when she usually started cooking. I noticed that I left my coffee mug on her counter between visits without thinking about it, and she never moved it. I noticed that when I hadn't been over in 4 or 5 days, the space on my side of the property line felt different, not empty, because that's too large a word, but less settled, less like the right temperature. I did not say any of this. I was being careful. In August, her sister came to visit for a week. I met her on the porch the second day. Her name was Petra. She was 3 years younger than Sylvie. She had the same deliberate quality, but deployed it differently. Where Sylvie used it to manage her space, Petra used it to take the measure of people. She shook my hand and looked at me the way a customs official looks at a passport, not unkindly, but thoroughly. Sylvie told her I was the neighbor who fixed things. Petra looked between us, looked at the mug I'd set on the porch railing that belonged to Sylvie's kitchen, and said, "Right." Just that, right, with the weight of someone who has already arrived at a conclusion and has chosen not to announce it. I finished the porch railing repair I'd come over to do and went home and sat in my kitchen and thought, for longer than I'd have admitted, about the way Petra had said right. Then September arrived, and with it a problem in the basement that was more involved than the others. A section of the waistline that had been badly repaired by someone before Sylvie owned the house, and which I'd noticed in February and flagged and now needed to actually fix before winter created the same disaster the frozen pipe had. I came over on a Saturday morning with the right materials and went downstairs and got to work. She checked on me at the 1-hour mark. Coffee, same as February, like we had a ritual that had been running long enough to have its own grammar. She went back upstairs. I kept working. Around the 2-hour mark, I heard her on the stairs again. She came to stand in the doorway the way she had in February. But the expression was different this time. Not the controlled panic of a flooding ceiling, something that had been decided before she came downstairs. She said, "Can I ask you something?" I said, "Go ahead." She said, "Why do you keep coming over?" I set down the fitting I was holding. Not because the question surprised me, it didn't, not entirely, but because it deserved more than an answer delivered while I was looking at pipe. I turned around and looked at her. I said, "You have a lot of things that need fixing." She said, "Joel, I could call a plumber." I said, "I know." She said, "I've known I could call a plumber since March." And I haven't, and you've kept coming. And I want to know if we're talking about what I think we're talking about, or if I'm reading something that isn't there, because I'd rather ask the question and be wrong than not ask it and spend another 6 months being careful, for no reason. The basement was quiet. The furnace kicked on. I was aware, in a way I hadn't let myself be for 9 months, of how much space she took up in the structure of my ordinary days, not as an intrusion, but as a load-bearing element. something the architecture had come to rely on. I said, "You're not reading something that isn't there." She looked at me for a long moment, long enough that I could see her deciding whether to accept what I'd said as sufficient or push until it was fully named. She pushed. She said, "Then say what is there." And so I did. Not eloquently. I am better with copper fittings than with the exact sentences for large feelings, and I told her that too, which made her smile in a way I had not seen before. A smile that was not her managed one, but the one underneath it. I told her that the rhythm we'd built had become the part of my week I counted on without realizing I was counting on it. I told her that careful had been the right way to be for a while, and that somewhere between the February pipe and the September waistline I had started to feel like maybe careful didn't have to mean withheld indefinitely. She listened the way she listened to things, without rushing to fill the silence. Then she said, "I didn't knock on your door in February because I'd looked up what to do and I needed a contractor." I said, "I know." She said, "Your light was on." And I understood what she meant. Not that she'd seen my light on and decided to knock because I was available. She'd seen my light on and known, already, that I was the person she wanted to knock on the door of. February had not been the beginning of something accidental. February had been the first decision. I finished the pipe. I stayed for dinner. We ate at the table that had been set for two since July without either of us naming it, and we talked about things we had not talked about before. The marriage, briefly, in the way of someone handing over something true without needing to perform it. The careful years. What the careful years had been for and whether they were finished. At the end of the evening, at her door, she said, "You left your mug." I said, "I know." She said, "It's been there since April." I said, "I'll get it eventually." She smiled. "The real one. Don't rush. We have not put a name on it yet. That is deliberate, on both sides. Because two careful people who have learned what happens when structures are trusted before they're tested have a mutual preference for letting things prove themselves slowly. The mug is still on the counter. I am still fixing things. She is still cooking for two. What I know is that 9 months of accumulated small evidence, coffee at the hour mark, a mug left on a counter, a sister who said right with the weight of a complete assessment, added up to something that was not small and was not accidental. And the only thing that had kept it from being said was the specific care of two people who had both, separately, decided to take their time. She asked because she was done taking her time, and I will not stop being grateful that she asked. There is someone in your life right now, or someone who has been in it, close enough to be load-bearing without either of you naming it, where something has been accumulating in the space between ordinary visits and small kindnesses, and a coffee left at the exact right moment. Have you ever been brave enough to go downstairs and ask the question? Or are you still being careful for reasons you stopped being able to name? If you're new here, subscribe. There are more of these. Leave your story in the comments. I read every single one, and the ones about the slow accumulations are the ones that stay with me longest.